The US dollar is dying. Not metaphorically. Not eventually. Now. And when the dollar dies, American power dies with it. This is not speculation. This is observation. The dollar's dominance as the global reserve currency is the foundation of American economic and military power. It is why the U.S. can run trillion-dollar deficits without immediate consequences. It is why the U.S. can sanction other countries into submission. It is why the U.S. military operates on every continent. The dollar is the invisible empire, and that empire is crumbling. Fast. Here is what most people do not understand. The U.S. dollar is not backed by gold. It has not been since 1971. The dollar is backed by trust. Trust that the U.S. will remain stable. Trust that the U.S. will honor its debts. Trust that the dollar will retain value. And most importantly, trust that the U.S. will not weaponize the dollar against you. That trust is evaporating. Countries around the world are reducing their dollar holdings. They are trading in other currencies. They are building alternative payment systems. They are diversifying their reserves into gold, euros, yuan, and even cryptocurrencies. This is called de-dollarization, and it is accelerating. Why is this happening? 3 reasons. First, the U.S. weaponized the dollar. After Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the U.S. and Europe froze Russia's foreign reserves. Roughly $300 billion of Russian central bank assets were seized. This was unprecedented. Yes, the U.S. has sanctioned countries before, but seizing another country's central bank reserves? That was a line no one thought would be crossed. And every country watching said, if they can do that to Russia, they can do it to us. China, India, Saudi Arabia, Brazil. Every country with significant dollar reserves realized that their money is not safe. The U.S. showed that it will use financial access as a weapon, and countries do not want to be vulnerable to that weapon. Second, the U.S. fiscal situation is unsustainable. The U.S. national debt is $36 trillion. That is 120% of GDP. The U.S. government runs deficits of $1.5 to $2 trillion per year. Interest payments on the debt are now over $1 trillion annually. That is more than the U.S. spends on defense. The U.S. is borrowing money just to pay interest on money it already borrowed. This is unsustainable. Every economist knows this, but no one in Washington will address it, because addressing it requires either cutting spending or raising taxes. Cutting spending is politically impossible. Social Security, Medicare, and defense are untouchable. Raising taxes is also politically impossible. So the U.S. just keeps borrowing. And the only reason the U.S. can keep borrowing is because the dollar is the global reserve currency. The world needs dollars. So the world buys U.S. Treasury bonds. But what happens when the world does not need dollars anymore? Then no one buys U.S. bonds. Then U.S. interest rates spike. Then the U.S. cannot afford to borrow. Then the U.S. government faces a choice: default on the debt or print money to pay it. Default destroys the dollar's credibility. Printing money destroys the dollar's value. Either way, the dollar dies. Common trigger. The U.S. is a Ponzi scheme that only works because everyone else plays along. Third, alternatives are emerging. For decades, there was no alternative to the dollar. If you wanted to trade internationally, you used dollars. If you wanted to hold reserves, you held dollars. There was no other option. But now, alternatives are being built. China is the biggest driver. China is the world's second largest economy and the largest trading nation. China wants to reduce its dependence on the dollar. So China is promoting the yuan as an alternative. China has established currency swap agreements with dozens of countries. These allow countries to trade with China in yuan instead of dollars. China has created the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS, as an alternative to SWIFT. SWIFT is the global messaging system for financial transactions. It is dollar-dominated and U.S.-controlled. CIPS allows countries to transact without using SWIFT or dollars. China is also pushing for yuan-denominated commodities. Oil, the most important globally traded commodity, is priced in dollars. This is called the petrodollar system. It is a huge source of dollar demand. If oil is priced in dollars, you need dollars to buy oil. China is the world's largest oil importer. China is negotiating with Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Iran to buy oil in yuan. If this happens, and it is happening, it breaks the petrodollar system. Demand for dollars drops. The yuan rises. But it is not just China. The BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are building an alternative financial architecture. BRICS represents 40% of the global population and 25% of global GDP. BRICS countries are increasingly trading in their own currencies instead of dollars. Russia and India trade in rubles and rupees. Brazil and China trade in reais and yuan. Saudi Arabia has expressed interest in joining BRICS. If Saudi Arabia joins BRICS and starts selling oil in yuan or a BRICS currency, the petrodollar is dead. And the BRICS are discussing creating a BRICS currency backed by a basket of commodities, including gold. If this currency launches and gains adoption, it becomes a real alternative to the dollar. Not immediately, but over time, it could rival the dollar for international trade and reserves. Europe is also moving away from the dollar. After the U.S. froze Russian reserves, Europe realized it is also vulnerable. If the U.S. decides Europe is not compliant, the U.S. could freeze European assets. Europe does not want that risk. So Europe is pushing for financial autonomy. The euro is already the second most held reserve currency after the dollar. Europe is strengthening euro-based payment systems. Europe is encouraging euro-denominated trade. The European Central Bank is exploring a digital euro that could be used for international transactions without touching the dollar system. Europe is not trying to destroy the dollar, but Europe is trying to reduce dependence on it, and that reduces dollar demand. Even U.S. allies are diversifying. Japan and South Korea, two of the U.S.'s closest allies, are reducing dollar holdings in their reserves. They are not abandoning the dollar, but they are not putting all their eggs in one basket. Central banks around the world are buying gold at record rates. In 2022 and 2023, central banks bought over 1,000 tons of gold per year. That is the highest level in decades. Why? Because gold is no one's liability. The dollar is a U.S. liability. If the U.S. fails, the dollar fails. Gold does not fail. It is a hedge against dollar collapse. When central banks buy gold instead of dollars, that is a vote of no confidence in the dollar. So what happens when the dollar loses reserve currency status? Let me be very clear. This does not happen overnight. Reserve currency transitions take decades. The British pound was the global reserve currency. It took from the 1920s to the 1950s for the dollar to fully replace the pound. The dollar will not disappear next year. But the process has begun, and the consequences will be catastrophic for the U.S. First, the U.S. loses the ability to run massive deficits without consequences. Right now, the U.S. borrows $2 trillion per year, and the world absorbs it. Why? Because the world needs dollars. When the world does not need dollars, demand for U.S. debt collapses. Interest rates on U.S. Treasury bonds spike. The U.S. government cannot afford to borrow. The U.S. faces a fiscal crisis. The government must cut spending dramatically. Social Security benefits get cut. Medicare gets cut. Defense spending gets cut. Or the government prints money. If the U.S. prints money to pay its debts, the dollar hyperinflates. We are talking Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, Venezuela levels of inflation. Your savings become worthless. A loaf of bread costs $1,000, then $10,000, then $100,000. Hyperinflation destroys an economy. It destroys a society. People cannot plan. Businesses cannot operate. The economy collapses. Second, the U.S. loses its sanctions power. The U.S. sanctions work because the world uses dollars. If you are sanctioned from the dollar system, you are sanctioned from the global economy. Russia was sanctioned from SWIFT in 2022. This was supposed to cripple Russia's economy. It did cause pain, but Russia adapted. Russia used alternative payment systems. Russia traded in rubles and yuan. Russia's economy did not collapse. Why? Because alternatives exist now. If the dollar loses dominance, U.S. sanctions become much less effective. Countries can trade outside the dollar system. The U.S. loses its main tool of coercion. The U.S. cannot punish adversaries economically. The U.S. loses leverage.